die Weltgeschichte ist das Weltgericht. So, okay, what's that phrase? Articles in German are a little bit rusty, but it's an important phrase. The world history is the world court, the world court of appeal. This is an important precept for both Marx and Hegel. And in fact, well, Marx, let's talk about Marx. Marx is a hugely complicated philosopher. He's very complicated for many reasons. Unlike Hegel and Kant, he's not a university professor. So he cannot use this excuse. So he is trying to write for the general public. But the trouble is that his writing is still very difficult. Well, so I have to keep this as short as possible on the one hand, but on the other, I gotta say these words. Most people who ever, read and talk about Marx do not understand Marx. Marx is probably the most misunderstood philosopher in the history of the world. And there are good reasons for that, there are bad reasons for that. Again, bad reasons is because Marx never really got around to formulating his philosophy and publishing it clearly. Marx, it's like it was always a work in progress. So Hegel, again, I told you, he's writing always and talking at the cutting edge of his understanding, Hegel, right? And Marx does the same. Unlike Hegel, Marx chose to not publish most of his works. So next year, when we are going to read Marx, most of his important works were never published. And in fact, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were not really particularly well known. Another huge issue that we're going to have. And thankfully, you are future University of London students. So you will have this commitment. Again, as a requirement of the University of London, you need to be able to understand that Marx is not Stalin. And to see how Soviet Union actually has very little, in fact, almost nothing to do with Marx whatsoever. And this is a huge challenge. Marx is hugely misunderstood for all sorts of reasons, but also he's difficult to understand for you and me because you need to bracket all of your presuppositions. Everything that you know about Marx is wrong. Throw it out. And imagine that this is a totally new person whom you've never heard about. This is the wow. Oh no. I would not trust this. Why? Because this is written in Russian. Okay? No, I'm not joking. Good Russian sources stopped being published in approximately 1920. And those sources which were good in 1920 are a little bit dated today. So everything that's published in Russian after 1920, you can safely burn and throw out the window, and you will not lose anything. Okay. Anyway, so let me go back to Marx. So yeah, again, Marx is working on the cutting edge and doesn't really publish much of anything. And Das Kapital is something like, he published the first volume. Second and third volumes, which was sort of scrapped together after he died. But he planned something like 27 volumes. So we don't have complete works. We do not have a complete statement of Marx's own work. His work was never finished. It was an ongoing project. So with everybody else we're going to study next year, there is some book that you can read. One book or maybe a couple books. With Marx, you don't have this book. There's a million different drafts and his thought is constantly evolving, constantly moving. Now, immediately, there are all sorts of tensions in Marx. On the one hand, Marx was a political activist. I told you, again, last time, that Marx says that all hitherto philosophers wanted to interpret the world, but the true task is to change it. So Marx, very important, is a political activist, but he is also a philosopher. And there's a tension between the two. And I want to say that as a political activist, Marx fails spectacularly. And he's to blame for this. It's completely his fault as a political activist that he's misunderstood. Because if you are a political activist, you have to understand the consequences of your actions. And you have to write in such a way that you cannot be misunderstood. And if you are misunderstood, it is your fault. And I blame Marx. I blame Marx for being misunderstood as an activist. That's an activist. But as a philosopher, it's not his duty, it's not his task to be clear. Again, think back to Rousseau. I cannot make myself clear to those who refuse to be attentive. So as a philosopher, he's misunderstood. And it is not his fault. Because the things that he's writing about are simply too complex. And I have spent most of my intellectual life actually wrestling with Marx. I've spent, most in the sense that I have spent more hours trying to make sense of Marx than of any other philosopher. And this immediately tells you two things: that Marx is extremely complicated because I had to spend so much time. But secondly, is that he's very interesting because it was worthwhile to spend this time. And I still think to this day that Marx is probably the single most important philosopher for us today in our time. He understands our present society like no one else. But in order to see these productive ideas in Marx, you have to dig very deep. Now, thankfully, we're going to have a whole month next year to talk about Marx. So this is going to be a very preliminary introduction, and I wanna lay some important groundwork for this. But immediately, I have to put these things on the board. So as an activist, he's a person who is trying to bring about communism, but as a philosopher, he does not try to bring about communism. As a philosopher, he's trying to understand. And so this is change, and specifically communism. But as a philosopher, he's trying to understand capitalism. And actually, of 10,000 pages that Marx wrote, he devotes like 3 to communism. Okay? Marx never writes about communism. You will be surprised. Next year, when we read Marx's own works, he never writes about communism. Because communism is his future society, somewhere, and it's going to be free society after human prehistory has ended and human history proper has begun. And then, let's not draw castles in the sky. Let history take its own course. So Marx almost never writes about communism. All of his 10,000 pages or something that he wrote, most of it is analysis of capitalism. And this is important to keep in mind. Now, another tension in Marx, which I immediately need to signal, is that structure and agency. Complicated words. Let me use them. Structure and agency. So, to what extent is human history determined by objective processes, especially by economic, what Marx would call the economic base? It's an important term that we will need to understand at some point. Economic base. And to what extent is human history not determined, but voluntaristic? And so, if you want to determine again, let me write the word voluntarism. In a sense that human individual action, agency matters, and human individual action can change the course of history, which is usually associated in the works of Marx with this issue of cultural or let's write cultural and political superstructure. So again, these 2 important words, base and superstructure. In German, Unterbau and Überbau. They don't mean anything by themselves. When Marx is talking about the base, he's talking about the economic base of society, which he at one point says that can be determined with the precision of the natural science. And then there's the cultural, political, religious, and other legal superstructure, which is built on top of it, which seems to be a place for some form of human freedom. Although, does Marx actually believe in human ontological, metaphysical freedom? Probably not. I mean, this is not Kant. But that's a complicated question. I mean, Marx wanted to dedicate Das Kapital actually to Charles Darwin. So are we talking about freedom, or is this materialism? Complicated words, complicated story. And related to this, there's another tension. So these are tensions in the sense of internal conflicts of Marxist philosophy. Marx as an activist versus Marx as a philosopher. Marx as a structuralist versus Marx as a voluntarist. A determinist versus a voluntarist. And the third important conflict is between pessimism and optimism. In the words of possibly the greatest Marxist after Marx, Antonio Gramsci, pessimismo dell'intelligenza, ottimismo della volontà. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Let me write it. Okay. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. This notion that when Marx looks outside the window at the way human history works, especially in his mature works, it's a big question, and these are big questions. Let me write them immediately on the board. Again, we will be mostly interested in Marx as an analyst of capitalism, not as a philosopher of communism. But communism is also kind of important. So let me write this. So is communism? Is it a good idea? First of all, good idea. And is it achievable? If you can achieve it, is it stable? Is it really more efficient than? Is it more efficient than capitalism, or is it more humane, or is it both? And how are these supposed to work? So these are all questions in Marx, and to cut a very long story short, very short, to all of these questions, there is no clear answer in Marx's writings. Marx oscillates. Again, Karl, what do you think? I don't know. I'm thinking about this. So there are reasons within Marx to think that communism is not a good idea. There are reasons in Marx to think that communism cannot be achieved. In Marx. And well, talk about stable, all this other stuff as well. So again, Marx, in his pessimistic moments, it seems that for Marx, communism is an impossible utopia. In his optimistic moments, he says, no, against the laws of history, we will achieve communism. It's a complicated story. Complicated story which also evolves from one work to another work. Okay, and I suppose something else I want to say immediately. Well, yeah, you can also talk about this in terms of materialism and idealism. Materialism, which is supposedly Marxist position, and idealism, which is supposedly not Marxist position, but actually he kind of has both. So in a very strange fashion, let me jump to the very end of the lecture, as if we already said everything about Marx. Let me talk a little bit about communism, because this tends to exercise people a lot. Again, mostly I want to talk about capitalism today. I do not want to talk about communism, but certain things I want to say, and these things are the following. So again, from the very beginning, just to be on the safe side, let me make certain precautions. So first of all, when Marx is talking about communism, he's talking about something like Rousseau's general will, or Mill's society of which is where people are capable of being improved by free and equal discussion, or Hegel's Rechtsstaat. So there are so you can compare communism to Rousseau, Mill, and Hegel. And in some sense, I think that it would be nice, like if we had 50 or if we had like 60 classes or 100 classes, it would be nice to go back to Rousseau, Mill, and Hegel after we talked about Marx. Because in some sense, these philosophers, I feel, are post-Marxist philosophers. They are trying to describe how society could work under communism. Remember, Marx doesn't write about communism. These guys write about communism, about how communism is supposed to work, where free, rational individuals freely decide how to organize their society together. So when I talk about Rousseau, Mill, and Hegel, so first of all, I am talking about this notion of free obedience, where your freedom is not limited by society, but is actually enabled by society. And this is again, so is this Aristotle? Yes, it's an important Aristotelian element in both Hegel and in Marx. That again, man is by nature a political animal. Our political participation does not restrict us, but enables us. So this is point number one. But much more importantly, maybe we are talking about an ideal, a normative ideal. So let me write the word normative ideal actually in red, because this is so important. Normative ideal. Remember how for Rousseau, the general will, again, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is not Jean-Jacques Stalin. He understands that the true social contract is very hard to realize, and upon close examination, it will be found that most states, strictly speaking, do not have laws, but are lawless tyrannies, something like that. In the same fashion, you can look at communism, even if it's impossible to realize communism, as a normative ideal to which you can compare actually existing societies. And it would be useful to talk about communism, even if it is impossible to achieve, because it's a normative ideal to compare reality to, even though maybe it's impossible to achieve. Yeah. That said, another thing, maybe I should immediately mention on the board. Maybe you could think also, and this is actually a very strong reading on my part. I mean, like a very strong claim on my part. This is again my opinion. Remember, I said Hegel, communitarian, liberal. This is my opinion. Likewise, this is my opinion about Marx. This is not from his textbook. Well, actually, I think I've seen this somewhere in one of the textbooks. Anyway, to think of communism as an ideal type. So this is a phrase from Max Weber, and my reading of Marx is extremely Weberian. I actually think that Weber should properly be considered a Marxist. For those of you who know anything about Max Weber, that's a very controversial assertion. Most people would be very upset if they heard me say this, but this is my reading of Weber, and this is also my Weberian reading of Marx. That again, you have to think of communism, capitalism, but also feudalism as certain models, idealized models, which are not actually supposed to exist in reality. Again, in the same fashion, how a mathematical model of physics of the solar system is an oversimplification. It is useful because it explains certain features, but it does not capture reality perfectly. In the same fashion, when Marx is talking about feudalism, capitalism, or communism, he's not talking about reality, but he's talking about certain idealized models which capture and explain certain things about reality, but are not really real. Marx's most important work, Das Kapital, is called The Critique of Political Economy. The Critique of Political Economy. Marx's most important work is not the analysis of the real world. Marx's most important work is the criticism of Adam Smith. Critique of Political Economy. Political economy, by the way, not right? In Russian. Anyway, so critique of political economy in the sense of critique of classical British political economy. People like Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, and all the rest of them. James Mill to some extent. Marx doesn't know about John Stuart Mill, but he has read James Mill, and he responds to James Mill, John Stuart's father. Anyway, so when Marx is going to be talking about capitalism, he's not talking about the real capitalism. He's talking about, like, if you want, a spherical capitalism in a vacuum, a sort of idealized model of what capitalism could be. Like essential elements, essential exaggerated elements of capitalism. Okay. Yeah. Just to confuse the hell out of everybody, let me again write on the board. I'm probably not going to explain this, but let me just signal this. So when people are trying to explain Marx, they usually begin, I won't, but I'm going to at least signal this, by saying that Marx is a product of three distinct schools of thought. So one of them is British political economy. So people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and all the rest of them. And there are important elements of Marx and Smith. Those of you who had presentations on Adam Smith, I said, no, for Adam Smith, the moral justification of capitalism is that capitalism provides wealth for all, universal opulence. This is the moral justification of capitalism. Shouldn't this remind us of John Rawls? This is exactly what Adam Smith says in The Wealth of Nations. Even the most frugal peasant is richer than an African king. So Maximin, the least advantaged member of society, is still better off. The least advantaged member of a capitalist society is still better off than the most advantaged, right? The king of Africa, of a pre-capitalist society. So there's an important Marxist element in Smith, and important Smithian element in Marx, I suppose. So British political economy. Second one is, well, actually, I should have started with this one, because this one is most important. This is German classical idealism. This is people like Hegel, and Marx is indebted to Hegel in all sorts of ways, and you can see very important elements of Hegel and Marx. And the third one is French socialism. French socialism. I mean, actually, it's people like Fourier and Proudhon, but you can imagine it's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Not exactly, but to oversimplify. So, Adam Smith, Hegel, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Well, we haven't talked about Smith, so maybe David Hume. David Hume, within this course, Hume, Hegel, and Rousseau. Okay? So that's an oversimplification, but, what can we do? That's the best we can do. So, Rousseau, Hegel, and, So, Rousseau, Hegel. Well, actually, not Rousseau. Mill. Let's right. I have this. Rousseau, Mill, Hegel. Excellent. Mill, Hegel, Rousseau. Excellent. Everything is clear now, right? Obviously. So anyway, where should we begin with Marx? It's probably enough about introductions. So, what is the most? I like to start presentations on Marx with this phrase, and I think it's true. What is the single most important thing for Marx? And I feel that maybe not the final answer, but a very good start is, like, what is most important political value for Marx? And I think the answer is freedom. Very importantly, not equality, not justice, but freedom. Some kind of equality, which is necessary for freedom, maybe. Some kind of justice, which is necessary for freedom, maybe. But freedom, first and foremost. Again, this, in some sense, maybe quasi-Aristotelian, teleological view of human beings. Eudaimonia, human happiness, flourishing, is our creative expression of our freedom. Doesn't John Stuart Mill talk about something like this? Development. Yes. Again, freedom, not equality. I'm sometimes tempted to say, fuck equality, we need freedom. So again, Soviet Union, don't think about Soviet Union when you think about Marx. Think of John Stuart Mill. In fact, I think you should. Unless you see important parallels. My feeling is that Mill and Marx agree on almost all important points. So unless you see that, you are misunderstanding Marx or Mill. But be that as it may. So let's start with freedom. And Marx, again, in some sense, continues the tradition we talked about. the tradition of classical political philosophy, people like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, but also Hegel, but also Mill. Well, even though he doesn't read Mill, but he reads other utilitarians. And the idea is that, like in historical times, people were unfree. They were slaves to pharaohs or slaves to monarchs. But now, finally, we have the constitution, and people can become free. And Marx sort of this is his point of entry into the discussion. And in his first major political work, before even he called himself a communist, which we are going to read next year, which is called On the Jewish Question, wonderful work. He contrasts what he calls mere political emancipation and true human emancipation. Mere political emancipation. Notice, freedom, we care about freedom, versus, so let me write emancipation, okay? Versus true human emancipation. Emancipation. So emancipation, liberation. Mere political versus true human. Now, what is he talking about? When he talks about mere political emancipation elsewhere, he calls this formal freedom. Formal freedom. Or maybe formal freedom and equality. Or formal freedom and equality. And the idea is very simple. So you have 24 hours a day. And the idea is that, again, in historical time, if you actually, again, forget about Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Mill. Look outside the window. Ask yourself this question. What do people do in the 24 hours that they have at their disposal throughout the day? And Marx is going to say that throughout most of human history, including mostly today, all 24 hours are spent doing one thing and one thing only. Work. So, you gotta sleep, obviously. But sleeping, what is sleeping? Sleeping is recovery for the next day of work. Well, you do maybe you eat. Okay, excellent. Yeah, so you intake calories in order to be more productive at work tomorrow. Maybe there is some entertainment or something like that, or you drink alcohol in the evening. Yeah, so you do these things, again, to be more productive at work in the morning. Maybe people get together, have romantic relationships, but more importantly, have sex and have children. Yes, that's also very important, because children are the next generation of workers. So this is also part of work, broadly defined. So all of and the rest is just simply being in the factory. So all of this, broadly speaking, is work. And Marx says that throughout human history, the reason why this was true was technology. Our technology of production. So this is why economics is important for Marx. And this is why he's going to say that base is more important than the superstructure. So, again, complicated story. Go back to it in the course of this lecture, hopefully. But again, Marx imagines that at the base of all society, you have this economic base, which he often calls mode of production. Mode of production. And on top of this base, you have the so this is the economic base, and this is the cultural, political, ideological, religious superstructure. Again, in German ideologies, Marx talks about the premises of all human history. He says the first premise of all human history is alive human beings. Human beings who are alive and not dead. And in order to be alive, there are certain things that human beings need to do, like provide themselves with food, shelter, clothing, that kind of thing. And so before you provide yourself with shelter, clothing, and all the rest of it, you cannot have culture. And this is why, again, economic base is, again, it's very important. Marx very famously said at some point in his life, I'm not a Marxist. You might have heard this phrase. Marx saying that I am not a Marxist. He said this in relation to this exact picture. Because some people read Marx as if the economic base 100% determines everything about the superstructure. Like, if last night, Manchester played against Barcelona, how do you know which club won? Well, you got to look at the economic base. This is not what Marx is saying. The relationship is complicated. And it's twofold. Base influences the superstructure, and the superstructure influences the base. Now, why is this an explanatory model and not just blah, blah, blah? Because base is more important. Base is primary. Base sets certain fundamental parameters within which the superstructure operates. So the movement goes in both directions. The influence goes in both directions, but the influence of the base is much more important. Although in certain junctions in human history, the superstructure can play a crucial role as well. Yeah. I need to talk about ideas. Let me talk about ideas in a second. Well, basically, again, Marx has this phrase that the ruling ideas of any time, of any historical period, are the ideas of the rulers. So ruling ideas are ideas of the rulers. We'll talk about this in a second. But let me go back to this picture, to 24 hours. So Marx is saying that basically, in the Middle Ages, it was impossible to create a free and equal society. A free and equal society. Well, again, we care about freedom. We care about freedom. Freedom was impossible in the Middle Ages because technology was such that the vast majority of the population, because of the technology, had to work basically 24 hours a day. And if you work 24 hours a day, you are not free in any meaningful respect. Now Marx says what happens is that as technology progresses, we acquire more space for the realization of human freedom. And basically you get capitalism, but in capitalism, even though, and so this is a complicated story, capitalism is necessary for communism. Without capitalism, there is no communism. And in fact, the best thing that has ever happened to humanity is capitalism. Capitalism is the best thing ever. Notice, again, take your preconceptions about Marx and burn them. This is not what Marx is about. Again, Marx is not about equality. He's about freedom. He's not about communism. He's about capitalism. And the best thing that has happened to humanity in all of its history, good and also necessary, is capitalism. And some Marxists today, actually some Marxists that you are going to study next year, but also in 2 years' time, this guy whose name is Bill Warren, for example, who comes out of your international relations textbook, Bill Warren. This is you will read about him in Bailey Smith, one of your main textbooks again next year and in 2 years' time in international relations. Actually says that it is too early for communism even today, even in the 21st century. Capitalism has not yet finished playing its historical part. Anyway, but what is this? What is this historical role? Well, there are many things that capitalism needs to do, but the most important thing that capitalism needs to do is to provide us with technological progress such that we can acquire space of true, genuine freedom and work not for 24 hours a day, but maybe for 16 hours a day, and then have 4 hours of freedom. And this is impossible without technology. This is impossible without capitalism. Because capitalism leads to technological progress. We'll talk about this in a second. Again, Marx has this wonderful quote. This is from volume 3 of Das Kapital. Volume 3 of Das Kapital, this is, so far into the closet that you're almost in Narnia. Well, that's a horrible reference. No, it's actually so deep beneath the ocean that you are almost in Riech and you are going to meet Cthulhu in a second. Anyway, so in fact, the realm of freedom actually begins only where labor, which is determined by necessity and mundane consideration, ceases. So freedom can begin only when labor, which is necessary for survival, stops. He says, just as a savage must wrestle with nature to satisfy his wants, to satisfy his needs, to maintain and to reproduce life, so must civilized man. So even in communism, you will need to satisfy your necessities, right? And in all social formations, and under all possible modes of production, you need to do this. With the development of the realm of our physical necessity, with the development of human beings, the realm of physical necessity expands as a result of his wants. This is a complicated point, but let me just signal this. Again, it's important for Marx. We're not talking about this primitive communism we're all living in huts. Marx thinks that throughout human history, human wants, human needs multiply. We get more needs, and that's actually a good thing. That's a sign of our development. It is a product of our development, byproduct of our development, but also a necessary condition of our development. So in communism, you won't have less things, you'll have more things, and you will have more wants. Anyway, but at the same time, the force of production which satisfy these wants also increase. So our wants increase, but also our productive capacity, our technology expands. Freedom in the realm of necessity. So we have the realm of freedom and the realm of necessity. What is the realm of freedom? This is the realm of freedom. Your free time. And this is the realm of necessity. The amount of time that you need to work. So this is the realm of freedom, F. And this is the realm of necessity, N. So he says freedom in the realm of necessity, this is not true freedom, but freedom in the realm of necessity can only consist in socialized man, the associated producers, rationally regulating their interchange with nature. Rationally regulating their interchange with nature. Bringing it under their common control, instead of being ruled by it as by a blind force of nature. So, immediately, let me write this and explain this in a second. So, what does it mean to be ruled by a blind force of nature? Well, he's talking about how today, under capitalist society, we do not regulate our interchange with nature rationally, but actually we regulate it through the mediation of the market. So we are not free, but we are ruled by what Marx calls coercive laws of competition in the market. Coercive laws of competition in the market, of market competition. Well, I'll explain this in a second. So anyway, but in communism, again, there is still realm of necessity. Freedom in the realm of necessity consists in socialized man, associated producer, rationally regulating their interchange with nature, bringing nature under our common control, and not being ruled by the market forces as by a blind force of nature, and achieving, satisfying our needs, right, with the least expenditure of energy and under conditions most favorable to and worthy of our human nature. But nonetheless, even under communism, it remains the realm of necessity. Only beyond the realm of necessity begins that development of human energy, which is an end in itself. Say hi to Aristotle. Again, human flourishing, human happiness is the productive development of our energies. Creative art, creative exercising our creative capacity. Or mill, higher pleasures, art, science, that kind of thing. Again, Marx, Mill, talking about broadly similar things. So again, so beyond the realm of necessity begins that development of human energy, which is an end in itself, a true realm of freedom, which, however, can blossom only with the realm of necessity as its basis. And then the final, most important phrase. The shortening of the working day is its basic prerequisite. The shortening of the working day is its basic prerequisite. So communism, to oversimplify, is the shortening of the length of the working day. The shortening of the length of the working day. So let me go back to this picture. So when you talk about this mere political versus true human emancipation, Marx says that as a result of the French Revolution, and to keep piling stuff on the board, let's also talk about this. Yeah, so Marx is an heir to these intellectual traditions, but also, very importantly, Marx is about responding to the, first and foremost, Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, which is, for the Marxists, a result of the Industrial Revolution. So these two events are most important for Marx, and he's responding to them. So he's trying to say that in the course of the Industrial Revolution, and more importantly, in the course of the French Revolution, people become merely politically emancipated. People acquire formal freedom. So this is a formal freedom, basically abolition of serfdom. What is the difference between serfdom and slavery? There is a technical difference in Marx, but I will oversimplify it. For the purposes of this class, I'm going to say serfdom and slavery are the same thing. It's not true for Marx, strictly speaking, but I'm going to oversimplify. So abolition of serfdom or slavery. Serfdom, крепостное право, right? What's the difference between serfdom and slavery? Good question, especially to ask in this country. Anyway, abolition of serfdom. So people become formally free. They are merely politically emancipated. So mere means only. So only political emancipation. But they are not truly free. Why? Because they are still ruled by coercive laws of competition in the market. Coercive market. So again, and here is where we begin talking about this spherical capitalism in the market. Spherical capitalism in the vacuum. What is this spherical capitalism in a vacuum for Marx? Well, you all know this from your economics courses. You have perfect competition. Under perfect competition, profit is zero. It's very important. So profit is zero. That's why the only way that businesses can survive is through innovation, but also by being as efficient as possible. But innovation is there. Innovation is a wonderful thing. Again, why capitalism is a good thing, actually. We'll talk about this in a second. But anyway, so profit is zero. And this means that, again, everybody is a price taker. and you don't choose what to do. You have to do certain things, otherwise you go bankrupt. Now, if you couple this, and again, Marx is talking about this from a historical perspective. Historically speaking, the Industrial Revolution in Britain begins with the Agricultural Revolution. And the Agricultural Revolution begins with, some of you might know this, enclosure. Enclosure. Have you heard about this before? Agarage. Yeah. Where the peasants are expelled from the land. Basically, the first stage of the Industrial Revolution is the rich landowners discover economies of scale. Economies of scale. And they realize that they do not need so many peasants. And so they expel peasants from the land. And actually, at the secret history of the world, which they don't teach you, at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain actually deploys more troops at home to fight against peasant rebellions than they deploy abroad against Napoleon. But nobody talks about that, except for Marx. So you have economies of scale, and this means expulsion of peasants from the land. And this creates the reserve army of unemployed. This is very important for Marx. Reserve army of unemployed. Does this remind you of something in Mill? To bear children above the necessary level is to harm everybody who earns their bread by being a day laborer. So again, this is simple laws of demand and supply. It says like there's more people, right? So labor supply shifts in this direction and wage falls. And notice, so partly this is because of demography, but also very importantly, this is because of technology. Technology like the economies of scale. Less and less people are needed. Robotization should be a wonderful thing, but actually it's not. Think about this, look this up. The result of robotization was not increase in living condition of the workers. No, the result was a decrease in the living conditions of the workers. Why? Because workers get fired and are now forced to work for lower wages. This is true as a matter of economical fact in 2019. Okay? And the reserve army of unemployed pushes the wage down to a certain particular level, and this level is, well, as low as it can go. And this is like technically speaking, the wage at which you are indifferent between dying of starvation and working a horrible job. And so this is what Marx calls subsistence wage, or if you want, survival wage. So in this spherical capitalism in a vacuum, everybody works at the subsistence wage. And notice, the bourgeoisie, so we are talking about two classes. We're talking about two classes somewhere around here. And the two classes are the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie are the owners of the means of production, the capitalists, and the proletariat are the workers, right? But it's very important that the bourgeoisie and the workers are not free. They are not free. They are not free. Neither of them, of any of those, none of us is free. The proletariat has to work or die of starvation, and the bourgeoisie, because of the coercive laws of competition in the market, also has to. Again, in the spherical capitalism in a vacuum, if you are a bourgeois, the only thing that you do is take care of your capital. This is what you do 100% of the time. Like again, if you think about this day with 24 hours. All of your if you are a proletariat, all of your 24 hours is earning a subsistence wage, and if you are a bourgeoisie, all of your 24 hours is taking care of your investments. Capital, basically. And unless you do that, unfortunately, sometimes you look out the window and see these things happen, like, the crisis of 2008. Unless you constantly strive to increase your capital, you risk going bankrupt. All the time. Again, the real world is more complicated than this. But Marx is not talking about the real world. He's talking about spherical capitalism in a vacuum. And basically, so Marx is responding not to reality outside the window, but he's responding to Adam Smith. Adam Smith says that in a well-governed society, in a well-governed state, the division of labor and capitalist enterprise leads to what Adam Smith calls universal opulence, wealth for all. And Marx says, no, because of the coercive laws of competition in the market, the poor get poorer, up until they reach the subsistence wage, and the rich get richer. But neither can enjoy their wealth. Well, the poor, obviously, because they don't have much, and the only thing they have, they eat. But the bourgeoisie, because they constantly have to find, investment. And cycles business cycle, crises, always threaten the bourgeoisie. That, you know, tomorrow you may become bankrupt and you become proletariat yourself. So it's very important. This is not human history for Marx. This is human pre-history. This is pre-history of humanity. Because human beings, in a very important respect, are not free. Neither the bourgeoisie nor the proletariat. This is pre-history. The bourgeoisie exploit the workers not because the bourgeoisie is evil. They have to exploit the workers, otherwise, in next crisis, they go bankrupt and they become proletariat themselves. This is very important. Again, talk about this determinism in Marx. The bourgeoisie are not evil. They are forced by circumstances to exploit the workers on the pain of becoming proletariat during the next business cycle, during the next crisis of overproduction. How does this lead to crisis of overproduction? Well, it's a complicated story. Okay. For those of you who know about economics, obviously, if you are paying the workers as little as possible, so basically, wage goes down, and this leads to underconsumed goods, so the workers cannot buy the goods, but also the money that you take out of circulation. The bourgeoisie does not spend but reinvests, so you have surplus capital and surplus goods, and this is what is called the crisis of overproduction. And Marx says that there's a natural tendency for the capitalist economy to cause the crisis of overproduction. And according to classical Marxists, the latest crisis of overproduction was in 2008, and we still feel the residues of these crises. The world economy has not yet recovered from this crisis, and the Marxist prediction always is that the next crisis might be even more horrible, and maybe the whole world economy will collapse. But who knows? That's complicated, and that's outside of this course. Anyway, so this is. Go back a step. Mere political emancipation. Yes, you are formally free, but really, you are forced by market necessity. And again, a very important notion in Marx is that economic power is political power. The fact that human beings sign contracts with their employer seemingly freely does not mean that they are free. They are forced on the pain of hunger, on the pain of starvation to work. And this is not real political freedom. So true human emancipation can only come somewhere in the future in communism, where we will recognize the system, understand the system, and bring it under our common control. And we'll stop being ruled by the market forces. We will regulate the market, if you want. And humans collectively will freely and rationally decide what to do together. And this will be communism. Let me pause here and digress a little bit. Some people say that communism has been tried and communism has failed. Nonsense! Rubbish! It's not true. I mean, first of all, neither China nor Russia were ever officially communist. So they were socialists on the way to building communism, but they were not officially communist. Point number one. Point number two, if you actually look at the way those countries work, I mean, first of all, horrible starting conditions for both of them. Extremely poor countries wrecked by war, including civil war. So horrible starting conditions. And basically, if you talk about human beings being ruled by necessity, yes, necessity. Or if you think about, again, China and Russia during the Cold War, a huge proportion of the GDP was military production. And military production, it's not exactly coercive laws of competition in the market. You understand, this is not freedom either. You are forced to build up nuclear arsenal. Otherwise, you risk being conquered by a foreign nation. So this is not freedom in any shape, matter, or form. So when you say that communism was, some people say communism was tried and failed, they don't know the slightest thing they're talking about. They're talking complete nonsense. It's not true. Now, it doesn't automatically mean that communism is a good idea and achievable. It doesn't mean that. But at least Soviet Russia and communist China have nothing to do with what Marx is talking about. But on the other hand, I want to say that in some limited fashion, that's very important, only in a limited fashion, I want to say that communism has been tried and actually has succeeded with flying colors. It's a grave assertion on my part, and let me substantiate it. So if you want to look at some kind of an example, and by the way, so let me do I have free space somewhere? I don't know. Yeah, whatever. Let's use it. So for Marx, there are basically three modes. I mean, I'm again oversimplifying, and these three would be feudalism, capitalism and communism. So under feudalism, what you have is, as Mill puts it, direct slavery under the force of war. Direct slavery under the force of war. So let me just write slavery. So the idea is that certain people, by force and violence, coerce other people into doing certain things. So again, the serf works for the lord under the threat of basically military violence, because if the serf does not do the proper work, the lord is going to come with his army and punish the serf. So this is not freedom. Under capitalism, we're also slaves, but we are slaves to the coercive laws of competition in the market. So coercive laws of competition in the market. And under communism, we freely and rationally decide. So free, rational decision making. And these are, again, in Weberian terms, these are ideal types. And I want to say that if you want to, again, my productive reading of Marx is when you look at the world today, you have to see our present situation as a combination of all three. Sometimes it happens that certain governments, let's not give any examples, rule over their citizens simply by force of violence. It happens. It happens today. So, at other times, you can see certain decisions which are made because of coercive laws of competition in the market. Again, most people in the world today choose their profession not because they're born shoemakers or delivery men or anything, but because circumstances force them. Again, interestingly, right? For Plato, in Plato's ideal republic, differently abled people do different tasks. You do what you are best at. Under capitalism, says Marx, differently abled people all do the same thing. Again, this phrase, if you want, capitalist collectivism, communist individualism. This is important, so let me write it on the board. Capitalist collectivism, communist individualism. So capitalist collectivism versus communist individualism. What does this mean? Under capitalism, we are ruled by these market forces of coercive laws of competition in the market. And it's as if we are mass-produced in a factory to everybody to do the same thing, at least the majority of the population. But only under communism, people will be truly able to express their different and varied abilities in cooperation with others. Because again, this idea that we have in Rousseau and in Hegel, but also very importantly in Mill, in a liberal theorist Mill, you express yourself in working with others. People develop their rich and varied abilities working with others. This is again a variable sum game, not a zero sum game. So some people today are forced by violence, and some of your actions may be forced by violence. Some of your actions are forced by the coercive laws of competition in the market, but some of your actions are free and rational. So can you see something like communism in the world today? And my answer is yes. And the example that I'm going to give is Wikipedia. And to the extent that you think that it's a good idea, I want to say that again, to a limited extent, because Wikipedia is not the whole world, it's not the whole economy, but to a limited extent that Wikipedia exists, this is an example that proves that communism works and actually succeeds with flying colors. Well, why do I say succeeds with flying colors? Well, first of all, like if you try to compare encyclopedias, Wikipedia is probably the single, like if you had to choose one encyclopedia, Wikipedia would be the best. I mean, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, for example, is better for philosophy, but as encyclopedias go in general, Wikipedia is the best, period. By the way, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is also done by volunteers and is also free of charge. So again, Wikipedia is produced by people freely. Nobody is forced to make articles for Wikipedia. So this is free, and I suppose rational, and also people cooperate in producing this, and they do this. Notice, if you want, as a free gift to the rest of humanity. And if you wrote an article for Wikipedia, and some people I know have, you are not limited by other people looking at your article. You are enabled. You want other people, again, the same way that an artist who does art for art's sake wants everybody to see his painting. In the same fashion, if you write a Wikipedia article, you want everybody to see this article and maybe contribute it, maybe improve it. This is free, rational. I mean, this is communism. Well, the big question is, can you generalize? So when you ask, is communism achievable in a limited fashion? The answer is yes. Look at Wikipedia. In a global fashion, that's a different question. Can you have the whole world organized the same way Wikipedia is organized. That's more complicated. But this is basically what Marx is talking about. So again, free, rational choice, people working together. Enabling, not restricting their own freedom. I'm not sure if this is the best use of our time, but let's talk in relation to this. Let's talk about alienation. So there is this word in Marx which I don't really like very much, but it's kind of important, so let's talk about this. Alienation. I don't like this word because Marx basically uses it when he's young. And when he becomes more mature, he kind of doesn't like it either. Actually, when we talk about alienation, in German it's two different words, Entfremdung and Entäußerung. And these two words have different technical meaning, but we'll oversimplify. And Marx says that, well, again, so alienation, like in Hegel, is something that prevents us from realizing our nature in the world. The fact that we feel ourselves alien to the world. We feel ourselves as if we're foreigners in this country. We're not happy, we're not fulfilled. And when Marx talks about alienation, he talks about 4 kinds of alienation. He says that under capitalism, people are alienated from the product of their labor, from the process of production. They're alienated from each other, and also, very importantly, they're alienated from what he calls Gattungswesen, which is something like human nature. Gattungswesen. Okay, let's go over step by step, and let's use Wikipedia as an example. So, when you make a product in the factory, you don't care about this product. Product, process, each other, and Gattungswesen. Gattungswesen, to oversimplify, human nature. Human nature. Something like that. Anyway, so in the factory, you are forced to make something like nuts and bolts, and you don't care about them. They're not yours. Compare this to writing a Wikipedia article. Or compare this to the way a painter paints a painting. This is something you truly care about. You deeply care about the product. Again, you, like writing a Wikipedia article, you are enabled by this article. I mean, horrible example, whatever. I mean, me giving this lecture, I care about this lecture. I want this lecture to be as good as possible. I'm recording it on 2 separate devices because I want to look at it later. This is the expression of my freedom. And product. Likewise, process. So under capitalism, especially under the spherical capitalism in a vacuum, you work the hours which the factory tells you to work. Basically, you don't choose when to work and how to work. Now, ideally, when you write Wikipedia articles, because again, nobody's paid to do this. People do this in their spare time, when they feel like it. I give this lecture not exactly in my spare time, whenever I feel like it, but I could talk to the administration maybe to reschedule this, to a different hour or something like that. Or like if I was recording this for YouTube, let's say, this would be, I would be more in control of the process. Although I gotta say that, like in general, I am fairly satisfied with the process. Let's put it that way. But of course, like at the end of the day, am I proletariat or am I bourgeoisie? That's a good question. You and me in this room. Well, short answer, of course, we're all bourgeoisie, but I could discuss that more, but let me go back to this picture. Thirdly, alienated from each other. Notice, again, if you are in the spherical capitalism in a vacuum, under the coercive laws of competition in the market, everybody is your enemy. Your fellow workers are your enemies because you compete for jobs. Your fellow capitalists are your enemies because, again, you compete in the market. The consumer is your enemy because you want to sell them the product which is as cheap as possible for as high a price as possible. Basically, capitalism is, as Hegel exactly says, market is the war of all against all. Hobbesian war of all against all. Compare this to the Wikipedia article. I want other people to see the Wikipedia article. I want other people to see this lecture. I mean, if I look at this and I think it's good enough, maybe I'll upload this to YouTube because I want other people to see my lecture on Marx. And the only reason I don't do this is because usually I'm not satisfied with the quality so far. Capitalism, communism. Capitalism, communism. Well, this Gattungswesen, this one is the most difficult one because it's a German word. Gattungswesen can be translated something like general nature. General nature. Well, actually, the direct translation is species being, but it's horrible. So let me use the word general nature. And the idea is this: dogs have dog nature, cats have cat nature, but humans do not have a human nature. So we do not have human nature. We have general nature. This is Hegel's master and slave dialectic. This notion that the slave does not produce something like, a beaver builds a dam. A beaver builds a dam instinctually. A beaver particularly builds this particular dam. But the slave acquires the capacity to produce universally. Not particularly, but universally. Like, human beings are like universal Turing machines. Human beings can produce whatever. In the course of economic development, through division of labor, through technological progress, human beings can make swords, bows, plows, but also cars, but also spaceships, but also Dyson spheres. Anything that it is possible to produce in general, humans can produce. It's a generalized capacity. And this generalized capacity under capitalism is not used by us, is not used for human flourishing, is not used for human needs, but is used by the coercive laws of competition in the market. By the way, when I say coercive laws of competition in the market, we are talking about profit for the sake of profit. Somewhat. So coercive laws of competition in the market is profit for the sake of profit. And you don't decide. As a capitalist, you don't decide. Again, think about this. If somebody gave you $1 million, would you be more happy or less happy? Probably less, especially the rational among you. Because you would try to find ways to invest this $1 million in the best possible fashion. You wouldn't invest this $1 million where you want to invest. You would try to find the best return on investment. It's not your decision. You play no part in this, even if you have a lot of money. You do what the market demands. Again, as a CEO of Pepsi Cola, you don't produce, let's imagine you're a patriot. American patriot, you want to make America great again or something like that. Whatever. And you want to produce the best possible product that would help, your rich stuff. But you don't. You produce what generates most profit. And if it's horrible for the individuals, if it makes them obese and sick and ruins people's lives, well, so what? You have to produce it because that's the thing that sells. You don't decide, even if you are the CEO of a global corporation. You are, again, the market decides for you, not you rationally decide. Okay, so product, process, each other, Gattungswesen. Gattungswesen, if you want, this is our capacity for freedom, which we have as a species. So this is, to oversimplify, something like Rousseau's perfectibility. Something like Rousseau's perfectibility. This notion that we could finally take control of our history and make what we want, but we don't. Under capitalism, we are forced to, obey the coercive laws of competition. Global warming, climate change, pollution, all the kind of stuff. Always excellent examples. Can the countries of the world get together and solve? Well, so far, they cannot. Why? Because of the coercive laws of the competition in the market. The first country that tries to reduce emissions, seriously tries to reduce emissions, will lose in the global struggle, in the global economic competition. And that's a big deal. That's an issue. Nuclear disarmament. You would want to disarm, but the one that disarms first is open to abuse, right? And this is, in some sense, all of Marx can be seen as, to oversimplify, all of Marx's analysis of capitalism is a failed prisoner's dilemma game. Failed prisoner's dilemma game. All of this. Okay. Let me talk. So this is alienation. Let me talk about transition to communism. I also have to talk about commodity fetishes at some point, and ideology, if I have time. I hope I'll have time for everything. So, this is strange. So anyway, how does transition from capitalism to communism work for Marx? So we're trying to understand what this is. Now let's talk about transition. Well, again, to oversimplify, the story is more difficult, but to oversimplify, there are three stages of humanity. feudalism, capitalism, and communism. To confuse the hell out of everybody, let me give you a little bit of Hegelian jargon, just for fun. And Hegelian jargon is modernity. Talk about modernity. We begin with undifferentiated unity. So for Hegel, this is ununterschiedene Einheit, undifferentiated unity. Something that Marx could call feudalism. This is a stage at which, for Hegel, community destroys the individual. Community destroys the individual. And in principle, if you forget about Socrates, if you forget about some minor or sometimes major incidents, by and large, there is harmony, but this is simple harmony. This is a simple, idiotic harmony in the dictionary sense of the term idiot. Human beings do not have self-consciousness, human beings do not have freedom, and that's why there is relative harmony. So, harmony. Stability. Well, actually, harmony, which is actually stagnation. Then, what you get at the second stage, and this is the French and the Industrial Revolution, is you have differentiated disunity. Differentiated disunity. And you get, so again, so this would be Industrial and French Revolution. And here is the idea is community and individuals are in dire conflict with one another. And you don't have any kind of harmony. You have constant conflict. Again, talk about this conflict consensus. So in Marx, you start with, for Marx and Hegel, you start with consensus, but it's a simple, stupid, stagnant consensus. Then you go through a stage of conflict, and then at the end of times, you resolve it and get consensus at the end of times. So again, conflict, consensus. So people like Callicles and Thrasymachus are on the side of conflict. People like Epicurus, let's say, are on the side of consensus. But Hegel and Marx are on both sides at the same time. Because it's a historical process. You move from consensus through conflict to consensus again. And at the third stage, which is for Hegel, Rechtsstaat, again, you have differentiated unity. Differentiated unity. So undifferentiated in the sense of we are all idiots. We're all products of our environment. Differentiation in the sense that we have freedom, we have self-determination, but this self-determination is conflictual. Differentiated unity in the sense that, yes, we have freedom and self-determination, but actually interests of the community and the individual are harmonized. Community and individual are harmonized. And this would be Rechtsstaat for Hegel or communism for Marx. Or the stage of society where people are capable of being improved by free and equal discussion for Mill. And so again, so this is feudalism, this is capitalism, this is feudalism, this is capitalism, and this is communism. Feudalism, capitalism, communism. Which, and again, my reading of Marx is if you want to understand the real world, you have to see the real world as a combination of the three. Anyway. So how does the transition work? From capitalism to communism. The transition from feudalism to capitalism works apart from human beings. There's something changes in the material base, and it becomes more profitable to give people formal freedom. Marx says that economic progress, and through it military advantage, forces countries to stop being feudal. Again, to oversimplify, capitalist, formally free England is simply technologically superior to feudal India or feudal China. And so advanced economies, not because people are good, in spite of themselves. Capitalism is good in spite of itself, right? Like it is a necessity of the market to give people formal freedom. It is a necessity of the market to abolish serfdom because this makes economy more productive and this makes your military more powerful. All power, to some extent, ultimately is economic for Marx. So again, so how does the transition work? And more specifically, why is capitalism such a good thing? And notice, again, so you have these stages and you cannot jump stages. You cannot, under any circumstances, have a communist revolution in feudal Russia in 1917. That's impossible, stupid, idiotic, and out of the question. And Lenin is not an idiot. So the only reason to have a revolution in Russia is because Russia is the weakest link. And the only real purpose of revolution in Russia, at least in the early stages, is to trigger revolution in Germany. Because Germany is an advanced capitalist country. And without a revolution in Germany, in principle, there should not be any revolution in Russia. So at the time when the Spartacus rebellion failed in Germany, the Russian communists had to pack and leave, or do something else. At least according to the standard Marxist theory. Well, Stalin and Bukharin had other ideas, but Stalin and Bukharin are not Marx. Let's remember at least one thing from this class. I mean, also, incidentally, communism is only possible as world communism for many different reasons. This example was nuclear proliferation. So if you are at war with other countries, you cannot afford to be free. Again, this issue of freedom, Wikipedia. You can do Wikipedia only when you're not in times of war. Mill says this. But in order to guarantee that there will be no wars in the future, so this is, Marx agrees with Kant about perpetual peace and disagrees with Hegel. But in order to achieve this stage, the whole world has to become communist. Communism in one country is completely impossible and out of the question. Marx writes this very clearly in the German ideology. We'll read this next year. Communism in one country is impossible, out of the question. Because through coercive laws of competition in the market, a single country which is communist will be forced to become capitalist. And basically, on the standard Marxist analysis, Stalin is the victory of counter-revolution in Russia. So when Stalin comes to power, counter-revolution has won, and you are not talking about communism anymore or socialism. You are talking about state capitalism. And the bourgeoisie are the government bureaucracy. Anyway, so why is and you cannot jump stages. You cannot jump stages. You go from feudalism through capitalism to communism. So why is capitalism the best thing that has ever happened to humanity, and what specifically capitalism does? So the first thing that capitalism does is technological progress. And capitalism does this for free. In a sense that the coercive laws of competition in the market force people to innovate. It's not a free decision of the capitalists. They're forced to innovate. They're forced to do something good. The second is already, we talked about this, formal freedom. Formal freedom. So basically abolition of slavery or abolition of serfdom. Because this increases, not because you care about people, but because this increases economic efficiency. Can you make capitalism work with slavery? Well, it's a complicated question. Marx thinks no. But the third very important point, and this is where it gets very tricky. So let me write this in brackets and with three question marks. Because what Marx talks about in the Communist Manifesto, and remember, Communist Manifesto is an early work. And Marx, later in his life, says this in a future preface to the Communist Manifesto. Communist Manifesto is wrong. Okay? Marx says this. Don't read this book anymore. Well, he says, we have to preserve it as a historical document, but strictly speaking, it is wrong. And I said how Marx doesn't publish much. He did publish Communist Manifesto, and he did publish a preface to the Communist Manifesto with corrections. So what is this third stage which comes in question in later Marx? It's that capitalism, for free, by itself, gives you the international, cosmopolitan, workers' nation. So more specifically, again, in Marx's own terms, he says that the proletariat is a class in itself. Do you remember Hegel? In itself, for itself. Yeah, something like this. So class in itself has to become a class for itself. So this is technical phrases. What Marx means by this is that workers need to understand that they have a common interest, and then they have to unite. Obviously, communism is going to be classless society. So in some sense, all of humanity needs to understand that they have common interest and unite. But this starts with the workers. And Marx thinks that this also happens inevitably in the course of, only in the Communist Manifesto, this is inevitable and automatic. So only in the Communist Manifesto, this is inevitable and automatic. In what sense? Marx thinks that competition will have to drive the wages down to the subsistence levels. And occasionally, in times of crisis, will drive them even below the subsistence level. So occasionally, because of the way the market works, the workers will have to starve to death. And so on the pain of starvation, they will necessarily, again, material-based economic superstructure, they will be forced by economic necessity to unionize, to make unions. again, communism is the reduction of the length of the working day, but communism is also trade unions. So communism is the reduction of the length of the working day, but it is also trade unions. This is what communism is for Marx. So people are forced by economic necessity to unite on the shop floor. Then they are forced to unite within a single factory. Then workers of factories are supposed to unite within the industry. The industries unite within the state. And between different states, workers have to unite. Again, it's very important. The British workers, the English workers, cannot achieve their goals unless they unionize with Irish workers. Because if British workers demand higher wages, then the industry simply moves to Ireland. And it's important that this has to start with advanced countries and move to poorer countries. So it is the workers of America who need to unionize workers of Syria. It is the workers of Israel who have to realize that they have the same interest with the workers of Palestine and help the workers of Palestine unionize. And Marx thinks that, again, this will be capitalism will force workers to do this through economic necessity. So this happens, again, inevitably and automatically. And he says how the trade unions also, in the course of this organization, will necessarily have to teach, to educate. Who will educate the educators? History will educate the educators. Die Weltgeschichte. Anyway, so education and true democracy, because again, communism is the only real functioning democracy for Marx. Marx doesn't like the word democracy because for him, democracy is this bourgeois democracy of mere political emancipation. But the true human emancipation, communism, is also, is the only real democracy for Marx. Anyway, so this is the biggest problem, because Marx thinks that this is going to happen automatically because the wages are going to be driven down to the subsistence wage and sometimes below through crisis. But if the capitalists can to some extent unite and maybe use the apparatus of the state to provide certain minimal social welfare, it doesn't have to be much, because again, the Communist Manifesto ends with this phrase, workers have nothing to lose but their chains. But if you give them something, a little bit to lose above their chains, the whole system collapses. And you can divide and conquer. And this is why, again, in later Marx, it becomes very clear that this process is actually, like if you move from volume 1 of Das Kapital to volume 2 of Das Kapital, this process stops being inevitable and stops being automatic. And what you actually need, the base itself is no longer sufficient, because economic necessity will not force workers to unionize. But workers need to now understand that they need to unionize. And this is not, so it used to be in the Communist Manifesto that the base gives you automatically the communist revolution. But now in later work, no, you need to have this International Workers' Party, the International, right, the Communist International, which needs to organize people. And there's nothing inevitable or automatic about this. This is a real struggle. Again, I erased this, but this was somewhere. It's here, yeah. So pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Pessimism of the intellect, because later Marx realizes we're not working with the laws of history. We are working against the laws of history. And there's nothing surefire about this struggle. Because if you have, like in Lenin, if you have the avant-garde of the Workers' Party, where is the economic mechanism which will ensure that the avant-garde of the party will take care of the workers, will have interest of the workers in mind, and not just become a new bureaucracy? No guarantees whatsoever. So again, pessimism of the intellect, but optimism only comes from the will, but not from the intellect. So nothing inevitable about communism in this last stage. So again, the stakes are high for Marx, it's socialism or barbarism, but there's no inevitability. So 1, 2, 3, and number four, again, only in the Communist Manifesto, capitalism destroys itself through the crisis of overproduction. So capitalism destroys itself through the crisis of overproduction. So all of this is completely automatic, but only in the Communist Manifesto. Couple words, nevertheless, about how Marx envisions communism. So first of all, some people say, communism is a childish utopia. Because who is going to scrub the toilets and do that kind of thing? Menial labor. Well, first of all, I have to tell you that many people enjoy menial labor. I mean, not to brag about my mom, but she recently brought a whole bag of apples from her country house because she just enjoys, planting flowers and tending to trees, and that's menial labor. But she does this freely. I mean, again, not to brag about my mom, but she has other sources of income. She doesn't have to do this, right? But even if menial labor is horrible and demeaning, because again, Wikipedia article is not menial labor. It is intellectual labor. But again, some people say, "Oh, horrible jobs in communism." But people, capitalism gives you something. We have. Who cares about menial labor? We have robots, for fuck's sake. And we already have them. And again, this is part of the internal dynamic of capitalism. And yeah, so I gave you this guy, Bill Warren. Bill Warren actually thinks that this process, these 4 stages, are not yet finished. Because before we can arrive at communism, even in 2019, it's too early for communism. Because we need more technological progress and we need more formal freedom. Because there are some countries in the world, let's not name names, which are still under, less than, have not been politically, even merely politically emancipated. And maybe, people like Jürgen Habermas will talk about this, how, rationality, communicative action will lead us in this direction, maybe slowly, maybe in a decade or a couple decades, or who knows, maybe in 100 years. So there's maybe still hope, who knows? That's a complicated question. But the way Marx envisions communism, again, I have to say, at the end of the day, Marx is an anarchist. Now, he's not an anarchist in the sense that he doesn't think that the state can simply be abolished and we go back. This is what he calls utopian socialism. Scientific socialism is to see the objective conditions. And not in the beginning of the revolution, but at the end of the revolution, the end point of the of the communist revolution is anarchy. Anarchy in the sense of, well, I don't want to talk about this, but he talks about how there's no army, no police. You have this rotation, something like the Athenian democracy, rotation of bureaucratic offices, average pay, or actually, I'm not sure what kind of pay you're going to have in communism, maybe no pay at all, this distributed system of councils and everything. Marx, ultimately, he wants all decisions to be made as local as possible. So this world government is this very loose federation of local anarchist communes. And if you ever want to look this up, Marx writes about this when he is writing about the Paris Commune. Paris Commune. I did not talk about commodity fetishism. I did not talk about ideology. Not sure this is useful, but let me just say one word about each. So when we talk about ideology, what is ideology? Again, I had this phrase that the ruling ideas are the ideas of the rulers. So an ideology is a certain way of looking at the world, which not necessarily intentionally, but misrepresents reality. So that the reason, Marx says, that you do not study this in your economics textbooks is because this goes against the interest of the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie have to be mad to tell you things which are against their interests. So okay, we'll talk about this more in class, but again, this ideology is not necessarily, it could be a lie, but it's not necessarily a lie. It is a misrepresentation of reality which stems from your peculiar position in the division of labor. And commodity fetishism, now this one is very important, and I can explain this very simply. So, Marx does not mean that you worship your iPhone or anything like that when he talks about commodity fetishism. He means that relations between things in the market hide or obscure relations between people. So ultimately, for Marx, economic relations are political relations. So to understand, what is commodity fetishism? What's it like to not be a commodity fetishist? You are a commodity fetishist if you think that you exchange dollars for products. You are not a commodity fetishist if you understand that dollars are congealed labor, concentrated labor, and you exchange it for products which are also concentrated labor. So if you want, what gets traded in the capitalist market are one type of slave labor to other type of slave labor. So when you buy a loaf of bread, you are retrospectively forcing the baker on the pain of starvation to bake your loaf of bread. And if you are a proletariat yourself, you trade your slave labor to somebody else's slave labor. And if you are bourgeoisie, you trade other people's slave labor for other people's slave labor. I understand I'm rushing through all these things too quickly, but I wanted to get this out. Marx is complicated, and hopefully we'll have a chance. Well, thankfully, a whole month next year. Okay, this is not the clearest presentation, but still. What do I want to say in the end? Well, again, so people, first of all, please, nuance. Understand that Marx is not Stalin. Understand that there are certain tensions within Marx. Again, all of these complicated questions that Marx is neither determinist nor a voluntarist. Again, And at the end of the day, I think it's an interesting question. Will humanity ever achieve communism? And I think that sort of on my optimistic days, optimism and things like, I kind of think that maybe we're moving in that direction. On my pessimistic days, I read especially certain contemporary Marxists whom you will cite, like Emanuel Wallerstein. And Wallerstein, I think, gives some very grave predictions about why this might never happen. But at the end of the day, and this is what I want to finish the lecture with, I'm reminded of a very famous French slogan of May of 1968. Is communism inevitable? We don't know. But the choice is very clear. So, socialism or barbarism? Socialism or barbarism? Let's see, in the coming decades, which one humanity will choose. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, people. I hope this was somewhat clear. If you have any questions, I would be glad to answer. Otherwise, thank you so very much. And next time, we'll talk about Nietzsche and Foucault.